Hello, 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 and welcome to another episode of Podcast Pasta. That's the podcast that's like pasta, not the podcast that's about pasta. As always, I'm your host, Mike. So recently, I did kind of this personal retrospective on Adult Swim. Not only talking about my own history growing up with a network/programming block, but also kind of analyzing why I think Adult Swim is so unique, especially given our current media landscape. That video had a pretty solid response. It got quite a few views, some likes, some comments. I even had a user say, oh, maybe you should try talking about more Adult Swim related content. And I figured, you know what, I could try. I mean, again, I did grow up with a lot of these shows, and I still do like what Adult Swim is putting out. So maybe I could have a fun, unique perspective on it. And I figured I would kind of talk about a show that I've only briefly talked about in previous episodes, but I guess kind of give my thoughts on the current state of Rick and Morty. Now, for those of you who have followed the show for a while, you'll know that I don't really make it a habit to do reviews, or at the very least, I don't label what I do as reviews or reviewing necessarily, only because, reviews are kind of its own specific niche in terms of you know, I don't know what you call film YouTube or whatever, and I just don't feel like I have the right chops to do that type of stuff. So I'm not labeling this as a review of Rick and Morty. Rather, I guess kind of think about a bit of a retrospective on my experience with Rick and Morty, as well as again talking about I think the kind of unique/weird state that Rick and Morty is finding itself in. Also, this video is going to be utilizing a bit of a unique editing style for me, so please bear with me, and let's get to it. Now, it's kind of interesting. I didn't start with Rick and Morty in the very beginning. I remember the first Rick and Morty episode I saw was actually at an anime convention. For those of you who've been to anime conventions, you're staying at a hotel or something, and you don't really have the best internet or anything, so you're forced to watch whatever's on the TV. And at the hotel I was staying, it was obviously some of the basic channels, one of them being Cartoon Network/Adult Swim. And I remember the episode was the first time that they introduced Blitz and Chips. I think that's season 1, if I'm remembering correctly. I apologize in advance, this is all going off of my memory, but anyways, it was the Blitz and Chips episode. And it kind of piqued my interest. I found it kind of very humorous. I laughed at a few of the jokes, so I thought, you know what, maybe I'll check it out from the very beginning. Yeah, other people were also talking about we're reviewing the show well, so I thought, yeah, I'll give it a shot. And like a lot of other people, I just fell in love with it from the get-go. And season 1, season 2, I think are in many ways still very peak for me in terms of especially the writing. I think I've talked about before that I've been critical of Dan Harmon's work, but I feel especially during the first 2 seasons, his worst impulses as a writer were kind of tempered. Part of that might be because it was a newer show, so he was kind of more obliged to kind of be beholden to his writing team or whatever. But no, I thought the writing was solid. I loved the performances, kind of the improvisational nature of some of the dialogue. And I think more than anything else, what kind of really piqued me during season 1 and 2 of Rick and Morty was, if I'm kind of remembering this correctly, it was kind of airing around the time when a lot of animated shows, both for adults and even kids shows, I think Adventure Time or BoJack Horseman, one of my favorite animated shows of all time, were kind of experimenting with these longer season arcs, right? Kind of moving away from the episode by episode adventures to kind of explore season long arc stories, and kind of having this veneer of like, okay, it might look like this kid friendly, animated show, but beneath the surface lies like deeper themes, right? Which is a trend we're still seeing now with Amazing Digital Circus and like what have you. But Rick and Morty was kind of writing off of that potential, right? This idea that, oh, it might be this silly sci-fi show with like this drunk scientist or anything, but it has the potential to really explore themes of like depression and like absentee parenting and stuff like that. And so I think more so than like what was actually being presented in the first two seasons of Rick and Morty was also like the potential that the show would have, which unfortunately would take kind of a bit of a turn with season three. I believe I've said in the past, I think in like the Dan Harmon video that I did, that season three is like, or I might be wrong, maybe I didn't mention it, but season three is my least favorite season of Rick and Morty, which still stands today, even with all the seasons that we've had. And there's so much that goes into that. From my understanding, there was like a lot of personal drama behind the scenes. During that season, there was like kind of a bit of conflict with like Justin Roiland. I think Dan Harmon was also going through a lot of like personal problems in his life, and I think a lot of that like negativity really seeped into the writing. Right? I find from what I remember, season three was like very pessimistic. I found it was like much more like kind of cynical in its approach to its writing, even more so than like the previous two seasons, right? Which I know that's like a hallmark of like Rick and Morty, but I found it was like kind of exceptionally pernicious in season three. So yeah, did not really care much for season three. I think from what I remember too, season three also kind of had this problem where I can't remember if it was like at the start of season three or towards the end of season three, they announced that the show was going to go into syndication, which well, I guess I should kind of go into like what syndication means for those who might not necessarily be familiar with the concept. So when a show is syndicated, usually when a show gets big enough, it goes into syndication, which basically means that it gets distributed across multiple networks for the sake of airing reruns. And like some of the biggest shows that we've ever have gone into syndication, right? Think like Seinfeld, Simpsons, Family Guy, a lot of like sitcoms, right? Really big sitcoms tend to go into syndication. And there's nothing inherently wrong with syndication in and of itself. I find, especially if your show is made with the intention of being syndicated, it can work really well. I mean, again, like some of the biggest, like a lot of the examples I listed earlier, part of the reason why they're still talked about today is because they're syndicated, is because people are still watching the reruns, even whether it be on like networks, even nowadays through like streaming platforms, right? The problem, though, is that with syndication, there comes certain kind of not hard set rules, but specific kind of a specific approach that you have to take when writing for a syndicated show. And a part of that is, as a writer, you now have to keep in mind that, like, oh, people are going to potentially be watching this as a rerun. You can't have a person just tune into a random episode of your show and just be completely lost, right? And that kind of makes certain things harder. So going back to what I previously said, part of the hype around like, or what I perceive as the hype around season one or two, is this potential that the show was going to do like kind of a deeper dive into like, again, themes of like depression and what have you. And that, it was going to start off as like kind of this disjointed, as kind of these disjointed adventures, but eventually it's going to build up to like have these longer arcs and what have you. And unfortunately, you can't really do that with a syndicated show. You can, like, in syndicated shows, you can have references to older episodes and stuff like that, or even bring back recurring villains, or what. In the case of Rick and Morty, bring back recurring villains. But usually it's like for special case scenario things, like either a season premiere or a season finale. And so, with that in mind, I think kind of the announcement of syndication kind of soured a lot of Rick and Morty fans' perception of the show, because it's like, oh, we're not going to get something like something as deep or interesting as BoJack Horseman. It's just going to be like kind of sci-fi sitcom, basically. Um, and that's kind of where the show has gone in a way, but yeah, going from season 4 onward, or at the very least in the beginning, there was kind of this, growing pains that I think the writers and the showrunners had to deal with. Part of another stipulation for syndicated shows is that you have to pump out a certain number of episodes to meet syndication guidelines. And so now the writers had to adjust to like a new schedule of like pumping out a lot of episodes. They had to adjust to the Justin Roiler's departure from the show, so they had to get new voice talent for both the Rick and Morty. I think if I remember correctly, or is it the same person doing both? I can't remember, but basically new voice talent. And so yeah, there was kind of this weird adjustment period where I think at least the initial episodes of season 4 kind of suffered because of that. But as the show went on in its run, they eventually found their footing in writing for the syndicated format. I think, like with any long running show, I also kind of, and this might just be a me thing personally, but with any long running show, it kind of becomes harder to make distinctions between like later episodes. Like for Simpsons, for example, tell me the difference between like a season 19 or season 20 episode. Most people can't, right? And I feel like Rick and Morty has kind of hit a similar stride. So past like season 3, I don't really make, at least in my mind, I don't really make that much of a distinction between seasons. A lot of them kind of blend together, with exception of like certain end arcs that happen with like season finales or season premieres. So with that, we're pretty much caught up with where Rick and Morty currently is. And so how is current Rick and Morty? With the most recent episodes of Rick and Morty, I think at the time of this recording, they're actually still airing their most current season. I think they're in the middle of it, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not 100% sure because I'm watching on HBO Max, and they've kind of stagnated the release between like, on-air Adult Swim and like what they're showing on HBO Max. Part of that might be certain syndication rules or other like promises that they have to, like, I think Amazon Prime and other streaming services. But anyways, at least from what I've seen of the most recent season of Rick and Morty, I've been kind of really enjoying it. Like I said, I think after the growing pains, they've really found their stride in writing for a syndicated show. And part of this might also be a change in my perception as a viewer, that like, okay, now I understand that we might not necessarily get like the deep, complex, analysis of something like BoJack Horseman or like the season long arcs or anything like that. I can enjoy the show for what it is. And I don't want to be too presumptuous, but I feel like a lot of people still watching Rick and Morty are also kind of the same boat. Like, we all acknowledge that it's not going to reach the peak that it was in season 1 or season 2, in terms of maybe not necessarily the writing, but at the very least the popularity of the show. But regardless, we're kind of enjoying the show for what it is. That it's still that even in this late stage of it, in this later stage of its like life cycle as a show, they're still exploring like interesting ideas. They're still interesting writing, and I still would recommend people watch like later seasons of Rick and Morty, even though it might not necessarily be for you. Just kind of understand that, like, some episodes you might be kind of more forgettable than others. Some episodes might bleed together with seasons outside of like, anything that specifically stands out, like the finales or the premieres. But I guess, where does this leave Rick and Morty now? So going kind of into the future of Rick and Morty, I'm not sure how long they have to continue the show. I think the show still pulls enough numbers, at least for Adult Swim standards, to like continue in its, to continue in its run. They recently announced that I think later in July they're going to be airing like the President Curtis series, which I'm not as optimistic about. Like, don't get me wrong, I'll probably check it out because I think they're going to do day and date release for that with HBO Max. So it's releasing on the same day as HBO Max. The problem is, from the trailers I've seen with President Curtis, I just don't think that it's distinct enough to really stand apart as opposed to Rick and Morty. Like, it feels like a very similar style of humor, just instead of like Rick and Morty, it's with President Curtis and like his team or whatever. And I don't know. I just don't think that really works well for spin-offs. Like, the example I like to give for like the formula for a successful spin-off is like Cheers going into like Frasier, right? Like, they are very distinct shows to the point where a lot of people that are fans of Frasier that maybe started with Frasier are surprised to learn that it is actually a spin-off of Cheers, right? And so I think that's the mark of like a good spin-off. If you could find your identity outside of the original series, but still like, but still regardless draw in like a new audience, right? And I just don't know if President Curtis is really going to be able to do that because of how similar it is to Rick and Morty. But that's, I guess, pretty much. I mean, I guess I could give some general thoughts on like Rick and Morty. I mean, more general thoughts on Rick and Morty as a whole outside of the specific retrospective section. So overall, I would say that I really do like Rick and Morty. I think regardless of like, its ups and downs, I think it is still, at the very least, a very fun show. I think it's kind of hit that perfect like syndication vibe of, something you could just put on the background maybe when you're eating, right? You could just really pop on and watch the reruns, which by design is what a syndicated show is supposed to do. Right. It's just unfortunate that, I don't know, maybe there's like an alternate world where we could have gotten like a more serious show out of this. And you could make the argument that that was never the point of Rick and Morty, that even at its peak, it's, considering like its age demographic around like teenage 14, I'm 14, this is so deep. It was never actually going to be able to do what like BoJack Horseman was going to do. I don't really know. It's tough to say. Yeah, I've talked about my gripes with like Dan Harmon and a lot of his writing, and obviously that still bleeds into Rick and Morty, especially with how they examine a lot of tropes of like the hyper intelligent genius that can't associate with other people, which has just become such an exhausting, such an exhausting cliche that we've seen in so many other places, right? And I don't know, a lot of the framing of certain issues or of certain topics just doesn't sit right with me. It's not enough to like completely ruin the show for me. It's not even a problem exclusive to Rick and Morty, but yeah, I think regardless, I would still like I said, I think I would still recommend Rick and Morty to a lot of people. If you haven't seen it in a while, maybe, I don't know, maybe they put up like guides of like episodes you can watch, episodes you can avoid, like kind of like a watch guide, because I think there are some episodes that you could skip. Like, there are like a lot of episodes you can skip and not really like even miss a lot of like good jokes or good humor. But yeah, I think that is mostly going to do it for me. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to my thoughts. You might have noticed that I've been experimenting with like new editing style for some of these episodes. Tell me what you think in the comments, if you like it or if you don't. I'm trying to go for like, I don't have to do like one take for a topic. I could just, segment it off and like, record more at my leisure, I guess, so to speak. So I'll see how this comes together in the editing room. If you want more Adult Swim content, leave a comment for that too. I'm not sure if I'm ready to kind of fall into that specific niche. I mean, I don't know if that niche is already taken by somebody else. I'm just not aware of it. I only did this. I mean, I partially did this because I had a user comment like, "Hey, maybe you should talk about." Like I said, "Hey, maybe you should talk about like more Adult Swim shows." And maybe I'll have to see what else I could talk about there, because there are like maybe a common side effects one would be interesting. This would actually be the first time I talked about Adult Swim shows. I think way back I did a review of Joe Parrot Talks with You. Um, but yeah, we'll see how that pans out. Next episode though, yeah, I'm not necessarily sure about next episode, but let's see. Any final thoughts while I'm here? Um, I've been enjoying 007 First Light. Might do a video on that. I think I just finished it up recently. So if you want that, again, like, comment, subscribe. It greatly helps the channel. Catch y'all later. Bye.